Welcome to Outlaw Bookseller, science fiction grunts, gripes and groans. You know where the grunts part comes from. But I think today I'm going to complain about things. I decided to do a lo-fi video because I was watching Scott Bradfield the other day, and he did these great videos about successful authors and their unsuccessful books. And he talked about a theory where you had to have a successful book before you could have an unsuccessful one so the critics could slag you off, and it was very funny actually. So I thought there's a few things I've been reading and looking at recently which haven't pleased me, and some things which have. So this isn't a full-blown review video. I guess it'll turn into that. There is one of those coming up, and there'll be something, you know, more high def coming as well. But I've just off the cuff moment because the video it is watching the football, and I just don't care. You know, in England are playing, but I'm not English, so what does that matter to me? So I thought we'd do the low key, lo-fi thing and spring it on you as a surprise. So what do I want to complain about? Well, I will be saying some positive things, but you will have seen that I've been playing with trains and shunting things around, as they say. So books, onto books. Dangerous Visions, edited by Harlan Ellison. The new Blackstone Press editions, hardcovers, and I couldn't decide whether I was going to get them or not, and I decided in the end to go for it. And I got this one, and I also got, again, Dangerous Visions, the sequel, of course, the sequel anthology. And of course, the last Dangerous Visions is coming later this year, but I decided not to buy that because the last Dangerous Visions, for various reasons, that we'll go into nearer time when it comes out, you know, really hasn't been a thing ever. It's never happened. It's happening now, and of course, it's happening now, and Harlan's gone, you know, and it was never going to be what it was meant to be in the first place. So I'm sort of not that keen on that as a project. But to talk about these, so I decided to get these, and I have to say, I'm not very happy with them. And it's not the content, because of course I've had my paperback copy of Dangerous Visions since, I don't know, 1986, and I've had my old pan paperbacks of, you know, this for like zillions of years as well, and sort of read them all a long time ago. But I decided to go for these, and I don't like them, and I'm going to tell you why. And it's about the production quality as much as anything else. And this is very heavy, and you know, if you ever come across me in my day job, he said, I will say it to people. What am I doing? I will say to people that, you know, this is a good quality book because it's heavy, and this weighs a ton, because that means the paper's good. Now the paper is very white, and it's quite shiny and slick, but like the paper in Library America books, it's really thin, and I hate reading books with really thin paper. I can handle almost any book, and for ages and for a long time, and it'll still look like new. It's a skill that I've had for many years because I've always wanted to look after my books, and also it's something that comes naturally when you work with books for a long time. But I really don't like the production quality of these, and also the boards are quite slick, and there's a feeling of cheapness about them despite the weight of the paper. The binding isn't great either. If you look at the top there, you know, there's no signatures or anything. And okay, there's not many signatures in terms of things being sewn on books these days anyway. But it just feels very cheap to me. It feels like something produced bargain basement, and I don't like the paper. Also, I don't like the jackets. The designs are nothing special, but they're very thick jacket, and they're slick underneath and very, very tough and hard, which in a way is good because they're durable. But I have to say, they just feel like something run off print on demand, you know, and I really, really don't like that. So in terms of production quality, despite their chunkiness, heaviness and thickness of jacket, I actually don't like them as books, and I don't know whether I'm going to hang on to them, but I'll show you this one again. And of course, you know, in the UK you have to try things like Amazon and Blackwell's to get hold of these, as they're not published over here. And they've got these, you know, they've got all the original material, of course, and they've also got Michael J. Straczynski's new introductions, and I just feel he's, you know, I'm sure he's a good guy, but I just feel he's trying too hard to be Harlan-esque. in his introductions, and I don't really like the tone of them. And it's weird because in a way it might have been a good thing to go with something that wasn't very Harlan at all, and that was maybe a little bit more critical in a literary sense. I'd been critical of Harlan because, you know, he had a lot of criticism. But yeah, they've not really worked for me. I'm not very keen on them. So I don't know. I guess I'll hang on to them because they're handy as reading copies. But I think I have more fun with my paperbacks, really. And the thing I like the most about Dangerous Visions is I actually like Harlan's introductions and afterwards, and the author's sort of extra comments more than most of the stories, if I'm honest. I mean, there's great stuff in them, really good. But there's also some things which are very sort of, you sort of think, I don't say meh, I don't do that thing. If I'm going to say why something's bad, I'll go into a proper explanation, except I'm not going to do that this time because I haven't prepared. But, you know, there is great stuff in here, like Riders of the Purple Wage by Philip Jose Farmer, and another favourite one of mine from here would be I and Gomorrah by Samuel L. Delany, which I think is one of the best short stories I've ever read, and certainly in my sort of top 5 or 10 science fiction stories. I must do a top 10 SF stories at some point. But there's a lot of things in here that, you know, I'm not that fussed on, really, to be honest. So I do think the British New Wave anthologies are better. And the New Tomorrow is edited by Norman Spinrad. That's a really good New Wave anthology, both British and American stuff. So yeah, so I'm sort of like slightly miffed about these and a bit unhappy that I spent the money on them. Still, you live and you learn, but I don't like the production quality. Now, I've got something else I could complain about here, but I'm going to do that in a proper reviews video. But I'm just going to flash on the screen, and that's Wolfbane by Paul and Cornbluth. I want to think a bit more before I say more about that, but I'll be talking about that in my next review video, which I hope to do this weekend. But I'll be making something else tomorrow, which will be a publisher overview. However, I have reread something which I think is really good, and the question is this the best science fiction anthology of all time? Well, you know, anthologies are always a mixed bag. This is, as you see, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and this is a Tor reissue. And the Science Fiction Hall of Fame was a project that was put together by the Science Fiction Writers of America, the guys who vote on the Nebula Award, way back in the mid-60s. And when they got the SFWA together, one of the first things they did was have like a vote on what they thought the best science fiction stories of all time were. And it was quite a complex thing to put together. And in the introduction by Robert Silverberg, who's also the nominal editor, he talks about the process, and it's quite convoluted and complex. And this was published in the UK, I think, by Sphere. I've got copies here somewhere, in 2 volumes. But this is a single volume edition I got from Dorset Bob a while ago. And it has to be said, you know, overall, this is a really amazing anthology. And if I were to say to somebody, if you wanted to read SF short stories from sort of just before the golden age until the mid-60s, even though I wouldn't say all the stories are great, this is an excellent, excellent overview, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more. They then went on and they did another few volumes. They did novellas and novelettes, and they split them in paperback into 3 volumes. And they're nowhere near as good to my personal taste. This is the one I like, which is the Novellas Book 2 by Ben Bova. I'll talk about that a bit later on. But just to talk about this, because this is good. And if you ever see it, especially if you see the 2nd volume, which has mostly the later stuff, really, really good. So this is what the Science Fiction Writers of America voted for as the best SF stories at that point. And of course, a lot of water's gone under the bridge since the mid-60s. The Nebula Award is, to me, pretty discredited now. People are virtually buying themselves into the SFWA. At least Norman Spinrad says that, and there seems to be some evidence behind that as well. And it's not as professional a body as it was. But you go through it, and I'm just going to take the jacket off, because should I take the jacket off? No, you like to see the jacket, and talk through it, because as I say, I've just reread it, and some of these stories I've read loads of times. And it has some just great stuff in it. And it begins with a story which is from about, I think, 1934. And I think 1929 was the sort of opening sort of date, as it were, that they chose for this. And that's Martian Odyssey by Stanley G. Weinbaum, who died very young, not long after this. And when you read this, It's about explorers on Mars, and one of them gets lost and he ends up meeting this alien. And it is really quite remarkable for the time it's written. You know, I'd rather read that than read The Martian. And it's just a great little story, you know, really, really good. And these things are of their time, but they're not dated. Nothing's dated, everything's of its time as far as I'm concerned. And if you can think back to the context, I mean, now it's very easy to be slick and sophisticated and up to date in your science and modern now. But of course, you know, that's because there's all this stuff that people have built on, you know, the precursors, the pioneers who did it first. They really deserve our respect because they didn't have so many models to work from. They were more imaginative, protean writers. So Martian Odyssey is really good. There's an amazing story in here called Twilight by John W. Campbell Jr., which is a sort of like late in the history of the universe thing. And it's got this very heavy, brooding, atmospheric style to it, which you don't associate with Campbell. You think is more tough, more sort of two-fisted and tough and problem solving. It's really atmospheric and it's really, really good actually. And it showed what he could do. And of course, the Golden Age, which gets bandied about, which really is just the Golden Age is his stewardship of SF in Astounding magazine from July 39 till the end of the 1940s. So, you know, he stopped actually writing fiction because of some contractual thing, I can't recall the details, he couldn't write fiction and edit a magazine at the same time. So he pretty much stopped writing fiction, which is a shame because he did great stuff. There's then a story by Lester Del Rey, who I'll pass over. I don't like to talk about Lester Del Rey, really. And also a Heinlein story called The Roads Must Roll, which is quite famous. But, I mean, Heinlein, I'm not a massive fan of. I like some of the early stuff. That one never did a lot for me at all. So, as you see, to begin with, I'm slightly ambiguous. I'm back and forth between stories. Then there's a story by Theodore Sturgeon. And Sturgeon, of the Golden Age writers in the States, was probably technically the best writer, but I've always found Sturgeon really uneven in everything I've read by him. Parts have been brilliant and parts have been very slapdash, and he always seems like a very uneven writer to me. But when he's cooking, he is technically the best writer from the Golden Age, easily. But he's also inconsistent. And Microcosmic God, which is a good story, it's about a guy who's really brilliant, and he actually invents sort of forms of life which are evolving really quickly, and they get up to speed in terms of their tech very quickly. And he asks them questions and gives them challenges, and he's like their god, and they solve things. And this scientist, he's up against an evil banker type figure. It's a good story, but there's always something about Sturgeon where the unevenness doesn't work for me. But I can see why people revere him. I think he's overrated. Then you get Nightfall by Isaac Asimov. Now, Nightfall is, I think, won some vote after this for being the greatest science fiction story ever. And Nightfall does that thing that the Three Body Problem does, that lots of SF stories do, that Night of Light by Philip Jose Farmer does, where it's the movement of cosmic bodies and how they affect the consciousness of the people living on certain planets. And in Nightfall, the people on the planet where Nightfall is set, it has 3 suns, so it's never ever dark. And then once in about, I think it's something like every few hundred years, it goes dark and they see the stars. I think it's thousands of years. And when that happens, the civilizations fall. So it's about people who are astronomers, who they think they know what stars are, they're not certain, and they're waiting for that moment. And it is a good story. It's got great ideas. And again, it's a pioneering thing. But again, Asimov as a writer at that point doesn't do a lot for me. He doesn't have massive literary virtues. You know, it's very well set out and muscular, and there's no points where you cringe. But he isn't really at that point yet, but his prose really gets much better, which is the 1950s with the first 2 robot novels, Caves of Steel and what's the other one called? Caves of Steel, and I've got them here somewhere. You can tell that I've had a few days off, can't you? Anyway, you know the ones, the first 2. And then one of my favourite stories, I mean, the people I really like from the Golden Age, two people in particular, and there's a story by one of them here, by A. Van Vogt, which is called The Weapon Shops, later expanded into The Weapon Shops of Isha, and The Weapon Makers, a diptych of books. And The Weapon Shops, from the very beginning, has this very strange atmosphere, and you can see the influence over Philip K. Dick, and it's set in this distant future where there's an empire with a queen or empress, and she rules over the planet, and it is Earth, I think, it is the planet Earth. And this couple are just walking at night through the village they live in, and there's a building there, and it's the weapon shop, and these weapon shops are popping up all over this empire, and there's just a kind of strangeness about it which I don't really want to go into. If you've never read The Weapon Shop, or the extended version of Weapon Shops of Issue, you really should. Really quite something. And there is almost a fantasy feel about it. There's an air of unreality. And what it is that Van Vogt really had the whole idea of cognitive dissonance down. He'd have these really weird ideas, and you just go, whoa, you know, what is that about? And even though Slan and Voyage of the Space Beagle, which was filmed as Alien, are, you know, probably more famous, Weapon Shop for me is the one where, you know, you can almost feel the switches clicking in people's heads at the time. And that thing about cognitive dissonance, of strangeness, of not being at home with the narrative, of it tripping you up, comes up quite a lot in this anthology. And that shows how important it was as one of the elements of SF for writers, because these are chosen by writers, as I say. Then there's the very wonderful Mimsy with the Borogroves by Lewis Paget. Now, Lewis Paget, of course, was a pseudonym that Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore used. And Kuttner and Moore are together my second sort of favourite Golden Age writer. I wouldn't say, I'm not ranking them behind Van Vogt, they just come up in this order. In fact, I prefer their work. I prefer Kuttner and Moore in this period to anybody. And it's a great story about time travel. There's a wonderful bit in it where it refers back to, obviously, Mimsy with the Borogroves is a quotation from Jabberwocky from the Alice books by Lewis Carroll. And there's one short moment where the narrative flips to Dodgson, Lewis Carroll, sitting with Alice Liddell and talking. And it's quite a queasy moment, and it reminds me of something that Alfred Bester did years later in a story called The Flowered Thunderbug, which flips in time, and there's a scene at the Royal Society with historical figures, and it's just absolutely brilliant way of ending the story. And I'm sure that this part of Mimsy inspired that Bester story. But it's really, really great. I mean, they're just colourful and florid and inventive and truly strange, truly strange. We then come to Huddling Place by Clifford Simak. Simak has never done a lot for me. I've tried and tried. I've always seen him as like a second-rate Bradbury. He's interesting at times. I never think his prose is as good as Bradbury's. He almost certainly influenced Bradbury. Bradbury was writing at this time, the early 40s. He started writing in the late 30s. He was writing a lot of crime stories and horror stories and things. And there is a kind of pastoral and whimsical and shadowy feel that comes from Simak. And there's a story called Huddling Place. And Huddling Place is good, and it's about people withdrawing into themselves, living in future world, and it's one particular character, and he starts withdrawing himself, and it's something which, it is good, it is a good story. It's one of the Simak stories I've got more time for, and it emotionally resonates with me, and it has a sort of affinity with E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. You can imagine Huddling Place being set in the same universe, and that's the moment where people pull back, and that happens in The Black Corridor by Michael Moorcock, of course, written much later, which was actually mostly written by Hilary Bailey. Oh, that's the legend. And you heard it here first. I'm going to do a video about this, but if you've ever read The Black Corridor by Michael Moorcock, my theory, and the theory of quite a few other Moorcock scholars, is that it's a precursor of the Hawkmoon books, because in it people start wearing masks and they won't eat in public, and that becomes a whole big thing with the Grand Britannian Empire in the Hawkmoon series later on. So there you go, you heard it here first. Another great story in this, which a lot of people will know the screen version of more than the actual story, is Arena by Frederick Brown. And Arena was a Star Trek episode, and the original Star Trek ones. I can't think what season it was in, but it's the one where Kirk has to fight the Gorn, which is an alien. It's basically like a lizard guy with a dinosaur's head. It's absolutely brilliant. And he has to fight this. And they come from different planets and different spaceships. And this more intelligent alien entity, which is like omnipotent, has said, you know, you're in each other's space. You've got to fight it out and what have you. And it gives William Shatner a chance to get his overhanging rib cage out and stuff. And it's great. And the guy with the dinosaur is brilliant. The difference, it's the same basic story, but the difference in this is that the alien isn't basically a reptilian humanoid. It's something far stranger. And Brown wrote lots of short stories. He wrote as much crime as he did SF, and he wrote some very, very, very short stories which are quite funny, and you've got to be in the mood for them. But Arena's a great one, so it really, really is. And yeah, and I remember first reading that and I thought, hang on a minute, this is the Star Trek story with a few differences. Then this First Contact by Murray Leinster, and that's where the term First Contact comes from. You know, these things that astronomers use, that we use now, they all come from SF writers. That's the thing. And Leinster, I'm not a massive fan again, but you know, he was doing things. He was talking about moving sideways in time, sidewise in time. You know, he's just quite a pioneering guy. And First Contact is really good. It's really good on the astronomical stuff. And there's an expedition into space, and they're surveying things, and they come across a spaceship from another civilization. And there's this deadlock where the two races, the aliens are quite humanoid. They want to get on, but they both feel that if one of them backs down, they'll be tracked back to their home planet, and there could be war. They could trade, but it could be war. And it's about that. And it does fall flat a little at the end because it relies on the biology of the aliens, the human beings being similar enough. And I'm not so sure that's the case. But it's great to read that again, you know. And you see in these stories the foundations of what came after. And this is where this is really important. So we're still in the 1940s here. Then you start to get into the 50s and things start to get a lot more interesting. And of course, what really marked the end of the golden age was the emergence of new magazines. And I've mentioned this many times before. And those magazines were the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which launched in 1949, edited by Anthony Boucher, and Galaxy, edited by Horace Gold, which was really the one. I mean, Galaxy, just the stuff, the Galaxy writers. And, you know, by that point, Campbell was getting a bit sort of cranky and left behind, really, even though he went on until 1970. A lot of writers didn't like working with him. And so there were other markets to go for with good editors who cared about the genre. And you know, gave them room when Campbell couldn't cope with them and when they couldn't cope with Campbell. I mean, Bester famously really didn't like Campbell at all. He thought he was a total crank, you know. So he was happier elsewhere. He was happier with Galaxy, and the part that Horace Gold played in helping Bester construct the Demolished Man and Stars My Destination is absolutely huge. You know, not co-authorship, but shepherd him and help him with ideas. You can't really ignore that. So we get the 50s, and you get Judith Merrill, who's the only woman in this book, and a story called That Only a Mother, which is good. It's from a female perspective. It's still a very solid SF story about a mother and a child. I'm going to tell you any more than that. But it is good. But she did better stuff later on, I think. And then you get Scanners Live in Vain by Cordwainer Smith, which, you know, was in an obscure magazine at the time, sort of 52, I think it was. And it sort of languished, but writers loved it. And he gradually built up this career of short stories in the one novel in Australia, The Instrumentality of Mankind series, which I did talk about on the channel a couple of years ago. And Scanners Live in Vain is very, very strange. But it's marvellous. It is marvellous. And you're trying to work out what's quite going on. But there's this whole sort of world that he starts to build in this. And if you like world building, Cordwainer Smith's good. And Cordwainer Smith, Paul Innebarger, was he was basically a spy and espionage agent, you know, and I think Psychological Warfare, he wrote the definitive textbook on it. He spent a lot of time in the Far East, and there's a kind of Shinozery feel to his work. There's an Asiatic feel in the prose, which is really, really great. So if you've never read Scanners Live in Vain, it's a good. It's not. Is it the best place to start? It's one of the earliest in the chronology for the instrumentality of mankind. I wouldn't say essentially the best place to start though, but you might have to have a crack at it once or twice, but it is great. Then you get Ray Bradbury, and by this point, early 50s, Bradbury's really cooking. And there's an excerpt basically from The Martian Chronicles, which is a fix-up novel. So it's one of the short stories, a story called Mars is Heaven. And Mars is Heaven is one of my very favourite Bradbury stories. It's absolutely, and it's a horror story really, but as you know, I always say that horror is not a genre, this is a bricolage, it's a science fiction story. Astronauts go to Mars, and they find themselves in a small middle American town, and everybody's lovely and it's great, and it's the sort of town they all grew up in on Earth, but there is something else to it, and it's fantastic, and the lyricism is there, and the literary quality, and you can see why Bradbury just walked into the slick magazines and left the pops behind at this point. Great stuff. C.N. Cornbluth, The Little Black Bag, which is a story I've read several times, about a doctor's bag that falls through from the future into the hands of a alcoholic slum-dwelling doctor, and it's a great story. Cornbluth, I blow hot and cold. Sometimes he's a bit too madcap for me, and a bit sort of frenetic and feverish, and you can imagine him being quite irritating as a human being. But he nails it in that one. Really, really good. I'll say more about Cornbluth in the next video, the one after when I do some reviews. But it's a good story, and years and years in between my rereading of it, and it always comes back very strong. Just the mark of a good story. Then Richard Matheson, who is underrated as a science fiction writer. I always think Matheson's great strength as a writer is his ability to depict human beings alone under intense stress in absurdly dangerous situations, like I Am Legend, where there's the one survivor among the vampires, and the Shrinking Man, when Scott Carey shrinks, and he's just so good at that. And the story in here is called Born of Man and Woman, which is the first person narrative of let's say, one of society's outcasts. And it sort of makes you think of things like The Enigma of Caspar Hauser. It makes you think of things like The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's very, very short. It's only like 3 pages long. It's a great, great story. And to do a story in 3 pages that is that impactful and isn't a gimmick is quite something. Then there's a Fritz Leiber story. I'm trying not to say Lieber. I've said Lieber for years, but my American friends out there, hey guys, all tell me it's Leiber. And I've been quite down on Leiber since I started the channel. I found the things I've reread or read by him since I started it to be less than seminal. Though I still love Conjure Wife, I still like For Fard and the Grey Mouser. I read a late story by him in a Nebula anthology, probably about 1.5 years ago, called, it was something to do with an airship, I can't think what it was called now, and it won an award, and it was a really nothing story. But Coming Attraction in here is absolutely fantastic story. It absolutely blew me away rereading it, and it's got a kind of sharpness to it, and there's almost a little, I wouldn't say it's a subgenre, there's a little category of science fiction stories, an approach, a sharpness of approach, which I really like in Coming Attraction. It's also in another story in this volume later on. And Coming Attraction is, I just need to leaf to it. And it's the sort of sharpness that I look for in really 50s stories. And it happens a lot more in the 60s and 70s. But there are only a handful of these sort of sharp, what would I call them? Scalpel stories, I guess I'd call them. And it begins with a guy pulls this girl out of the path of a car that's coming along. This car has fish hooks welded on it, and it tears her skirt off. And it reminds me of A Clockwork Orange. And it's just really, really tight. And it's a British guy. He's in the New York of the future. He's gone over there for business reasons, I seem to remember. And he's finding this place which is transformed. Everybody wears masks. Women have to wear masks. And again, that made me think of The Black Corridor and the Hawkmoon books, because people have to wear masks in Great Britain in the future and that. And it's just an amazing story. And you can see the influence that Leiber had over Michael Moorcock in this. And it's almost like a cyberpunk story. There's no cyber in it, but it's very punk, it's very streetwise. It has the feel of hard-boiled crime. It's very well written. And, you know, and there's things like he says about this last was the end of an anti-sex song being sung by some religionists. And that reminds you of 1984, the Junior Anti-Sex League. So you can see how he pulled that in. It's a story that's packed with ideas, and it's very sharp and inventive, and it really cuts, and I love that. Then there's a story which has always baffled me, and I think it's because I don't know enough about Catholicism. And it's a story by Anthony Boucher, who was the editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And funnily enough, I was reading his collected short stories from Nesfa recently, and that story was in there, and it's come up again here. And I've read it twice in the last 3 weeks, and it's called The Quest for Saint Aquin, and something to do with Thomas Aquinas, I'm sure. And I'm not going to describe it to you, but I just don't get it, and I think I need to do a bit more research into religion to get it or read it again. It's really well written, but I don't know. Sometimes you get the feeling you miss something. You know it's you, not the story, and I think it's me in this case, because Butcher's stuff generally really good. Then there's Surface Tension by James Blish, which is part of the Seedling Stars, which is the greatest pan-trippy thing ever. Never mind Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time. The Seedling Stars, particularly Surface Tension, is just amazing. Absolutely brilliant story, and it's about people on a future space exploration, and they're seeding planets, and the only way they crash on this water planet, and the only way they can survive this by genetically engineering their offspring to be really tiny, and it's really quite, it sounds absurd, but it's brilliant story, conceptual breakthrough, paradigm shift. It's all in there, and wonderful stuff, and it's just happens on this really small scale, and it's just brilliant. Then there's a story which I've always felt is horribly overrated, and it's the sort of thing that impresses you when you're about 12 or 13, and that's Arthur C. Clarke's 9 Billion Names of God. And you know, it's the one about the computer trying to work out all the names of God, and it does it, and then, well, we won't tell you if you haven't read it. It's quite a short story, it's quite painless, but there's something really anodyne about Clarke these days. I just find that his style, or complete lack of it, his flatness, no matter how good his ideas are, just do nothing for me. However, it's followed by another scalpel story, a really sharp story, by Jerome Bixby. Now, Jerome Bixby, you don't hear a lot about these days, but I mean, he comes up mostly as the guy who wrote It, The Terror from Beyond Space, which is a 50s SF film, which some people say, you know, is the precursor of Alien. It has similarities to Alien, but it's not the true precursor. The true precursor is Black Destroyer and Discord in Scarlet from Voyage of the Space Beagle, as I said earlier on. But his best known story, and he wrote some good stories, is a story called It's a Good Life, and good is italicized. It's a Good Life. And this really is a sharp story, and it is about 15 pages long. And it's about this family who live in a rural location, and they have a capricious young son who has a certain power. It's hard to describe what it is, and you don't want to give the game away, but he really has the power of life and death over his entire family, and he is a horribly sort of enfant terrible character, and the only way they can stop this child from being an absolute monster is to be really upbeat and what have you. And it reminds you in a way of the McCarthyite period when it was written. So people had to pretend to be happy with the post-war American dream. They had to pretend they weren't communists. They, you know, couldn't say too much about the status quo. So it is a kind of dystopia in miniature, and in that way it's brilliant. It's done through personal relationships, and it's a really sort of chilling story. Excellent stuff. So that, and Born of Man and Woman, you know, very scalpel sharp. And you get another one of those stories later on. But the one that pops up next, which is more of a classic hard SF story, does have a slight element of that. It's a story called The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin, which is really famous. And when I first read the Cold Equations, it's from the mid-50s, it's about 55, I couldn't believe that it was so late. It felt like something from the early 40s to me. It's a real Campbell story. Tom Godwin wrote a number of stories. He never ever wrote anything as popular again as this particular story, Cold Equations. It's a great title. And it's fundamentally about a spaceship, and a young woman has stowed away. And because the weights have all been worked out, that, it's not going to be able to land or go wherever it's going. It's not going to be able to land without it crashing because there's too much weight on board. And the captain has to make a decision about whether she'll be thrown into space or whether there's another way out. And the equations are cold. The equations say, no, there's only one way you can do it. And I think Asimov felt that, this is silly. There would be ways around this. But it does sort of stick with you. And it's very Campbell. It's an engineering story. And it's had a big impact. But because he never sort of really managed to do it with a novel in the same way, he remains remembered largely for that. And I have read other stuff by him. There's been at least one paperback collection of his work, but it's the Cold Equations people go back to. And this is followed by a story which I don't rate that highly, by one of my very favourite SF writers, and that's Fondly Fahrenheit by Alfred Bester. And I love Bester, and I've always felt that Fondly Fahrenheit is nowhere near as good as a lot of his other stories. It does have a certain experimental quality in it about point of view, and it is good, but I think I came to it hearing it was really, really something. I don't think it is. I think The Pie Man from Dark Side of the Earth is way, way, way better. I think Time is the Traitor is better. I think The Men Who Murdered Muhammad is better. I can name you, probably half a dozen or more Adam and No Eve stories by Bester, which are better than Fondly Fahrenheit. So I'm not going to spend much time on it because I'm not that fond of it. Then we get the other scalpel sharp story in here, which is one of the best SF stories I've ever read, and it's by somebody I have ambiguous feelings about. That's Damon Knight. And Damon Knight, of course, made his name as a critic a lot. He wrote a lot of novels, a lot of short stories. I've always found him very, very patchy and inconsistent. He did that thing where he hedged his way out of defining SF by saying, oh, science fiction is whatever, when I point at something and say that's science fiction, that's my definition of science fiction. Ridiculous. If you're a critic, you should be able to sort of argue better than that. And but this story, the Country of the Kind, is just brilliant, and it's a massive influence over a brilliant SF story from, I think it's the late 80s, early 90s, by John Kessel, called The Pure Product, which is one of my favourite post-1980 SF short stories. And it's the first person narrative of a man in the future who is unlike the rest of society. He is an outsider, rather like the outsider in Matheson's Born of Man and Woman, but more extreme. And the guy is born a criminal. And in this future society, it's utopian, and there is no crime. And everything is tickety-boo and fantastic. So how does that society deal with this guy? And it has this real rapacious, abrasive quality early on, as you see this guy going about being a criminal and being a psychopath. But then your sympathy starts to arise, and Knight twists the knob of emotion, and he takes it from one part of the spectrum to another, a whole gamut of things. And it's really excellent. And as I say, I think John Kessel pretty much covered it, did his cover version in The Pure Product, except that John Kessel has less willingness to turn that dial, and he keeps it very hard and sharp and scalpel sharp. And that's the sort of thing, maybe scalpel SF is a thing, I don't know. And it closes down with The Rose for Ecclesiastes by Roger Zelazny, which is brilliant. One of his early stories, my favourite Zelazny short, and which is very poetic. And it's when you're seeing a Baroque sort of literary style starting to come into American SF. Zelazny was one of the sort of precursors of American New Wave, one of the very fine writers. He went off the boil later on, but him, Delaney, Silverberg, a really good company. And it ends with that. So this is a great anthology to sort of watch out for. So highlights, my favourite stories from this very important anthology are, in order of their publication, Twilight by John W. Campbell, The Weapon Shop by A.E. Van Vogt, Mimsy with Borogroves by Lewis Paget, Kuttner and Moore. Then we have Mars is Heaven by Ray Bradbury, Coming Attraction by Fritz Leiber, Surface Tension by James Blish, It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby. The Country of the Kind by Damon Knight. It's also got Flowers for Algernon in it, which I missed out, the short version, which is just beautiful. Brilliant story. Talk about that again. And Rose of Ecclesiastes. I think if I had to pick one story, I would probably, This Is Hard, The Weapon Shop, Mars is Heaven, and probably The Country of the Kind is my sort of thing these days, and I've read it many times, so it's great stuff. So if you ever can pick this up, pick it up. I've talked far longer than I was going to. I'm sorry if I rambled on. Hope you enjoyed that. And we'll have a publisher thing coming up next. And when will this go up? Will it go up Thursday night, Friday night? I don't know. Anyway, subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. Thanks for all your super thanks and views recently. Hope you enjoyed the stuff when I went up with Dorset Bob and all those sort of things. And we'll get up to a high def thing next time. Bye for now.